can I just ask, could I just take a temperature check from the audience, not literally temperature check. How many people here believe that a two-state solution to Israel-Palestine conflict is possible? Okay, that's interesting. Interesting. How many people believe that the solution is, if you like, one democratic state? Okay. Is ought to be, or feel, oh yeah, okay. How many people don't know? Sorry, I'm just doing a rough, I'm trying to, okay. Right, very good, thanks. How many people here think the Labour Party's policy on the Middle East is adequate? How many people have read the Labour Party's policy? Okay, I'll come to that. Good, that answers it. No, sorry, it is all for a purpose. It's not to make anyone look stupid, because I'm just trying to, there are bits of my talk that I can tweak, or I want to tweak to fit. How many people here would be fully supportive of pushing in your CLP or ward for the Labour Party to fully support boycott, divestment and sanctions, in all honesty? Oh, okay. How many people would be against that or unsure about that? Okay, so I've gotten all right. Okay, so now that's interesting because my pitch that I was making here was actually going to be aimed much more, if you like, at on this issue, centrist audience that were kind of in two minds about two states. That wouldn't have the gumption to take boycott, divestment, sanctions to their ward or CLP and needed convincing on the issues. So this might appear a little more soft than you would otherwise like it. But actually, why don't we look at it this way? It looks like we agree on a lot already, the core issues, yeah? I think that what we need to think about is how we get the Labour Party overall and the members who are not in this room and the voters to the position where most of this audience is. And that's what I'd like to, I call it a pitch. That's what I'm going to talk about. See how it goes. And then there are some exam questions, because I like exam questions, some practical things what I'd like you to maybe think about in discussion and workshops. Right, 24 minutes, let's go. Look. In the last 25 years, we've been told that a two-state solution to Israel-Palestine will emerge from something called the Oslo peace process, that it'll happen on a gradualistic basis by mutual consent. Belief in the Oslo peace process has been the dominant orthodoxy which has informed mainstream commentary on Israel-Palestine and actually the policies of most political parties and organisations. But I think after 25 years, it's time to recognise what's happened. Oslo has been a complete and utter failure. It's been a roadmap to nowhere, if it was ever going anywhere. And this is a problem. It's actually made the plight of the Palestinians, who are the oppressed, fundamentally worse than before Oslo started. So I think as a result of that, we need mainstream commentators, we need political parties, including the Labour Party and other parties, to have a rethink on Israel-Palestine. As part of that process, though, we need to understand, before we make our asks, we do need to understand why the Oslo peace process failed, so that we can help come to a better solution. Right, I'm not going to go through the full history of everything since, and Mike's looking very happy about this, everything since 1890, 1917 and everything. So forgive me, it's one of those talks on Israel-Palestine, I'm just going to have to dip into things. But if I leave significant things out, please pick me up on it on Q&A. I'm going to quick overview of Oslo, because it's important to understand. In 1993, and in the agreements that came before it and the agreements that came after it, there's something that we can call the Oslo process. Under that process, the PLO recognised, that's the Palestine Liberation Organisation, recognised Israel, and Israel recognised the PLO. Okay, so mutual recognition, good. Prior to 1993, prior to the Oslo Accords, the Palestine Liberation Organisation had already accepted a two-state solution. By doing that, they gave up a claim, that's the Palestinians gave up their claim to a state on what was 78% of historic Palestine, because they accepted the existence of Israel, and therefore a Palestinian state could only be West Bank and Gaza, 22% of historic Palestine. So Palestinians have already given up 78%. The newly formed Palestinian Authority had to sign up to not boycotting Israel. That's interesting. That was one of the conditions that Israel wanted. And the Arab countries, who had had a very successful economic boycott until then, also gave up the boycott. What did the Palestinians get in return? They got full control over 18% of the West Bank, called Area A, but you could call it Bantustan A, if you use the South African analogy. That constituted no more than 5% of historic Palestine. They were given some control over their affairs on a further 22% of the West Bank, called Area B, but you might as well call it Bantustan B. The rest of the West Bank, and don't forget the total of the West Bank is only 22% of historic Palestine, the rest of the West Bank would remain under full Israeli control, including the most fertile lands of the Jordan Valley. The Oslo Accord did not promise Palestinians a state. It said there would be a kind of 5-year transitional period during which there would be various talks, and there would be something called final status talks. So there was no guarantee of a Palestinian state. So if you think about it, that's not a great deal that the Palestinians signed up to. It doesn't sound very good, but it's even worse, because Oslo left out the absolute core issues for Palestinians, which is the right of return of refugees, the status of Jerusalem, and the illegal settlements, and where will the borders of Israel end? Israel, even to this day, has not declared its borders. Unbelievable. If that wasn't bad enough, Oslo is also, the language of Oslo is very interesting, because what Oslo very deliberately does is put the wording of the agreement outside of any terms that are used under the international law. So it doesn't use terms that come from the Geneva Fourth Convention, which governs how occupying powers should treat the occupied. It doesn't deal with, it doesn't use many of the terms from UN resolutions, which are also framed in international law. And so that's a very deliberate attempt, it was a very deliberate attempt, clever attempt, and a successful attempt to take the issue of Palestinian rights to take that away from the language of international law and international humanitarian law. What did the Israelis do in return? Well, they had to give up nothing. It's not clear to me, having read Oslo, what Israel had to give up. Didn't have to give up nothing. But here's the important point. Israel did not at any point have to give up its claim, however spurious that may be, based on biblical texts or translations from Aramaic documents or whatever. Israel did not have to give up any dubious claims to the West Bank and Gaza. And to this day, the Likud party, which actually strangely is not the most right-wing party in Israel. I mean, in Israeli politics, Likud is almost centre compared to the others. To this day, claims dominion over the whole of the West Bank. And the phrase which comes out again and again from Israeli politicians and leaders of all parties is, all this land is ours. So Israel gave up nothing. So Palestinians, it looked to me, were required to give up pretty much everything up front on the basis that there will be something in the following 5 years that might or might not happen. Just a quick word on the refugees. I talked about the refugees and the right of return of refugees as being a core issue. Just for the, I'm sure you all know, many people don't. The issue of refugees is not just the refugees that were made refugees after Israel's conquests in 1967. The issue of refugees is fundamental to the issue of Palestinian rights because it goes back to the original sin, which is 1947-48, and the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians forcibly from their homes as part of and the events leading up to the creation of Israel in 1947-48. I haven't got time to go into all that now. It's important to remember one other thing. When Palestinians talk about the right of return of refugees, it's not something they've made up. UN General Assembly Resolution 194, which has been reaffirmed many, many times, gives Palestinian refugees the right of return to their homes, and the right of return of refugees is also enshrined in general international law. So that was the Oslo Accords in 1993. What actually happened? Because it looked like a bad deal from the start. The first thing to note is there were no final status talks. Not after 5 years, not after 10 years, not after 15 years, not after 20 years, not after 25 years. It's never happened. So they never got to the core issues. And I think that was quite deliberate. It was never intended to be. Lest anyone thinks that Oslo was some golden period of peace and things weren't as bad as they are now. Look, the first 20 years of Oslo, and these figures are taken from an Oxfam report. The first 20 years of Oslo, 1993 to 2013. So this is before protective edge in Gaza, 7,000 Palestinian killed, 15,000 Palestinian structures, such as houses and farm buildings, destroyed, 440 kilometres of apartheid wall, as the Palestinians call it, security fence, as the Israelis call it, built. By the way, the Berlin Wall was only ever 155 kilometres. The height of most of Israel's apartheid wall is approaching 8 metres. The Berlin Wall, on average, was 3.6 metres high. It gives you an idea. Israel installed 550 checkpoints across the West Bank, which choke off daily life for Palestinians and travel. 11,000 Palestinian residents of Jerusalem had their residency revoked as Israel ramped up the Judaization of Jerusalem. And here's the thing. The number of illegal settlers on what had been Palestinian land doubled from 250,000 to 500,000. Strangely, Oslo, in its precise wording, did not stop even the expansion of the settlements. And the sad fact to notice on this, for anyone who still has notions that somehow the Israeli Labour Party is some kind of progressive party, has a feeling for Palestinians, the fastest rate of expansion and the biggest growth in settler population occurred under Israeli Labour governments. In fact, the right wing, the far right, in Israel taunt Netanyahu to this day. They say, you're not really strong enough, Netanyahu, because even the leftists, which they call Labour, doubled the number of settlers. What have you done? You haven't done half of what they've managed to do. Gaza's been under a siege for 10 years. Look, I could go on and on and on. The reality is, life for Palestinians, whether they be Palestinian citizens of Israel, whether they be Palestinians living in Gaza, whether they be Palestinians in Jerusalem or the West Bank, has got significantly worse in the 20 years of Oslo. So the answer to the question of what happened under the Oslo Accords, I think you can summarise all that to say what happened was that Israel continued to do, without impunity, what it has always done since 1947-48 to Palestinians. And that's to implement ruthlessly policies of discrimination, segregation, expulsion, land confiscation, and the rest. And that's all been part of its decades-long quest to effectively subjugate the Palestinian people. So I think we now move to what do we do? And I think, firstly, we need to have a rethink. It's nothing radical. I think everyone in this room knows it, but maybe I should be giving this talk to another audience who don't know it. Look, the first thing is the Oslo process, I think, is synonymous with the idea of a two-state solution. And I think we have to recognise, and this is what any new thing, any revised thinking needs to do, I think we have to recognise that a two-state solution may now be impossible. Not just because there's no will on the part of Israel to actually grant Palestinians a state, but because of the facts on the ground. I mean, if you look at the picture of where Palestinians now have control over their own affairs in the West Bank, it is a series of small, isolated Bantustans. It's essentially natives having been driven off the land into reservations. And therefore, a two-state solution, it's difficult to see how that's going to happen. So, and even worse, Many Israeli politicians, leading politicians and political parties are now openly and loudly calling for the annexation of the West Bank, which basically means you just take it over and say it's ours. In fact, the only opposition that's coming to that I can see is from those is politicians, and sometimes they're on the Israeli left, who say, well, actually, we don't need to do that by legal means. Why make trouble for ourselves? Because we are doing it de facto. In other words, it's a reality in any case. Why do we have to put people's noses out of joint by actually making it a legal announcement, but such as Israeli politics? So I think the first thing we need to do is, I think the fundamental thing we need to do is that any rethink on Israel-Palestine needs to be based on, I think, on a set of consistent principles around the rights and lives of citizens. Whether or not, in the end, the outcome is one state, two state, no states, or many states. Because we need something which is tied into ethics, people's rights, people's lives, not where someone may or may not decide to draw the pencil line on a map. And I think on that, it's clear where we go. The call has to be not around two states, not around one state, but it has to be around freedom, justice, and equality. That's what Palestinians ask. The largest grouping of Palestinian civil society organisations since 2005 have been calling for freedom, justice, and equality to be the principles underlying support for Palestinians. Freedom, an end to Israel's occupation, the dismantling of the apartheid war, and self-determination. Justice, the right of return of refugees to their homes. Equality, full equality under the law and constitution for Palestinian citizens of Israel who face systematic discrimination. In order to get freedom, justice, and equality, Palestinian civil society has called for people of conscience across the world to support a programme and campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. On the basis that if governments won't do this, won't act, it is time, and it's long been time, for citizens to act. And I think that was one of the things we were discussing with Rivka. I think I asked a loaded question about it, knowing that I'd be raising it. But there is that issue. It's not just about pushing it to our politicians. We need to push our politicians, but we also have power ourselves, and there are things we can and should do. So I think for a rethink, freedom, justice, and equality should be the watchwords when we talk about Palestinian rights. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions needs to be the tool that we should say is absolutely the tool that should be used. And somehow we need to think about how we get that reflected in Labour Party politics. Notice one thing, freedom, justice, equality does not say one state or two states. It very deliberately does not say one state, two states. And that comes back to something I was saying earlier. So we need to have a set of underlying principles that are not dependent on where someone is going to draw a line. It should be about human rights and civil rights, irrespective of the state or where the boundary is. The other thing I think that we all recognise is there has to be some mechanism by which parties, but I would say particularly Israel as the oppressor, can be held to account for its actions. One of the other great failings of Oslo, of course, is there is no such mechanism. So I now want to turn to the Labour Party policy on Palestine. Okay, so the exam question then is, if we have broad agreement on what I've been saying, I say broad agreement, on what I've been saying up to now around freedom, justice, equality, around boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The issue is, let's see, and we have to start from somewhere, and the place we need to start is where existing Labour Party policy is. So look, there it is. Labour is committed to a comprehensive peace in the Middle East, tick, based on a two-state solution. I would say query why. A secure Israel alongside a secure and viable state of Palestine. Okay, there can be no military solution to this conflict. Okay, all sides must avoid taking action that would make peace harder to achieve. Who could disagree with that? That means an end to the blockade, occupation and settlements, and an end to rocket and terror attacks. Okay, who could disagree with that? Question of whether one causes the other. There's an issue of causality there. Labour will continue to press for an immediate return to meaningful negotiations. I wasn't aware there was any meaningful negotiations, so I'm not sure how you return to something which doesn't exist in the first place, but that's me being pedantic. Diplomatic solution, immediately recognise the state of Palestine. And then there's another interesting little paragraph, not on the Middle East section, but on arms embargo, which says actually, which is what Rivka was saying, I think there is a will amongst the Labour leadership, and particularly Jeremy Corbyn, to actually do something around arms. And I would say Israel is a prime, along with Saudi Arabia, let's start with two, would be prime targets for an arms embargo. Okay, so here's what I want to do. The thing I think, the challenge for us, if we believe in freedom, justice, equality, we're kind of agnostic as to whether it's one state, two states or no states. That should be for Palestinians to decide, not for us. I think the challenge then is to look at Labour Party policy and say, how can we develop that, and how might we develop that in a way which we would be happy to go to our CLP wards and carry a lot of people with us. And I'm not just saying carry our own supporters, if you like, who are firm supporters of Palestinian rights, but carry people who are less concerned maybe about this issue as a priority, or maybe a bit more sitting on the fence. So here are the two things that struck me when I read the policy. The first is, I think what we need to do, and want something which we should do with the support of, and we need the support and input of Labour Party members, is what are the practical and effective actions that a future Labour government could and would take to pressurise Israel to fully comply with its obligations under international law. Arms embargo seems to be, ticking the box. But what else? Are there other things? Not a long shopping list, but thinking about 1, 2, 3 things that would be effective, a Labour government could do, and potentially would be a game changer. For example, and I've given some prompts there for the discussion workshop, but that was just my thoughts. But we need to understand what the appetite is in this room and amongst you and others for that. The second thing, and it only struck me up, at first I read this and I thought, actually, this is not bad given that we know how quickly the manifesto had to be put together. To be honest, the Labour Party did a fantastic job to get the manifesto out. Even better job leaking it and getting the press coverage twice. That was truly brilliant. So actually, I take that. But now we have a little time, hopefully, we should think about it. There's something slightly that troubles me about the wording and the tone of that statement, and that's about the framing of the conflict. The manifesto wording there draws no distinction between oppressor and oppressed. It doesn't recognise the huge economic and military asymmetry that exists between Israel as the oppressor and the Palestinians as the oppressed. I don't think we can and should frame this conflict as one between equals, or 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. I don't think, and I think Labour Party has a proud record on progressive internationalism. I don't think we should ever shy away from calling the oppressor, and for making sure that the obligations in a situation where there's oppressor and oppressed, and where there are such glaring asymmetries in power, economic, military, political, that we need to do something to be on the side of the oppressed and not sitting, if you like, saying it's half a dozen one and 6 of the other. As to how we do that, how we frame that, I don't know, but you're all intelligent people and bright people who've come here, and so maybe that's something that we could think about. Maybe I'm being oversensitive. Maybe actually you think, well, he's being a bit oversensitive about that. You should just look at the words. It's clear. But it struck me actually only after a couple of reads. I think it is important how we frame this issue, that it's not a conflict of equals. So on that, I would say I will leave it to you, if I may, on how we do those things. I think the most important thing is, though, it has to be practical and credible. Like the domestic policy manifesto was, we may not get everything in one go. We may not get to the end point on the first jump. But something that fundamentally changes, is deliverable, practical, and I like things which are ratchet. Once it's done, it's very difficult then for anyone to row back on. Arms embargo is a good one, because at what point do you say the arms embargo is off? Israel would have to fundamentally change much of what it does in terms of policing and military in the West Bank and everywhere else. And I think the illegal settlements is another good one on that. Not that I'm trying to push you towards those directions, but they might be ones. And maybe there is something around humanitarian stuff. I mean, electricity, food, water, building materials for Gaza. I don't know. I thought I would leave that for you. So apologies for hearing a pitch which you were all in agreement with from the first. I had not expected that. It's a pleasant surprise. But I would like to come back to, it was, if you take it in the spirit that I did that, which I really tried to think about, what if at least half the audience wasn't with me? How would I try and make the pitch? Hopefully that in itself, well, it's been useful for me, it's useful for you, and then we can take on and develop and think about what that means for Labour Party policy, if anything. Thank you.